Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cloud Show. Today, we're going to talk about distributed systems, and we're going to talk about it in the terms of figuring out the most sort of underrated and hard things about building distributed systems. And for that, the star of the show is the distributed systems expert, Laïla. Hello.
Hello.
See what I called you there, the distributed systems expert?
Yeah, I'm like, oh my God, he's overdoing it again.
No, that's true. It's true.
Thanks for
Hey, it's
having
good to
me
see
again.
you. Welcome back to the show. This is your second appearance.
Yes, thank you for having me again. It's good to see
Absolutely. You didn't have enough of the show last time? That's good.
you too. Apparently, you keep convincing me, so here I am.
There you are. All right, that's great. And I know that distributed systems is a big deal for a lot of people, and they're trying to build something really great, and it's hard. There are some problems and some challenges to tackle in this space. So tell us first, like, who are you? Why do you know anything about distributed systems, if you will?
Yeah, great. So my name's Laïla. I work for a company called Particular Software, where we build NServiceBus. And I'm basically mostly focused and specialized in message-based systems, event-driven systems, if you will. And I've been building these systems for over a decade now. So there's one or two things that I picked up along the way, I guess.
Just a little bit.
A little bit.
But you're from Belgium, right?
Yes, absolutely. Waffles
Right.
and fries and ice cream and
Lovely things, all good things. All right. Now, actually, I was there just recently, right, for the conference. It's a really good conference down there at the Tekorama.
yeah.
Yeah. That was good.
Absolutely. One of my favorites.
In fact, we had already scheduled this this session at that time, so we didn't schedule it then. We had this on the books for a couple of months, right?
Yes.
You're a busy person, and you're like, can I schedule you in June?
sorry, but I'm here. That's all
Yes,
that
now
matters.
you're here, and it's all to our benefit. So let's dive into it. Let's go into distributed systems. Some underrated hard things about building distributed systems. I mean, the floor is yours. Take it away. What are we talking about?
Thank you. Well, one of the things that I like to bring up is that we spend so much time, especially in event-driven systems, talking about, oh, should this be a command or should this be an event? And what are our service boundaries and which service is going to communicate with what? And no, that service should call that service. We don't want that type of coupling. Should we do orchestration or choreography? And it's like so many discussions. And I mean, they're valuable discussions, right? They're important discussions. They shape how the system is going to look like. But there's this one thing that is like an oversight over and over and over again. And it's basically, how are we going to version this system? Like, the system is going to evolve over time, right? It's not going to be perfect from day one. Business requirements change, our understanding of the domain changes, and then things are going to have to change. So how do we do that in a way that doesn't break the rest of the system?
Oh, that's interesting. So the over focus is on the shape of the thing, but they're not understanding, or maybe not putting enough emphasis on the fact that there is an evolution here. You will have revisions of this thing.
Yes. So I think it's really important to think about it that way from the start. Like, how are we going to prepare ourselves for that type of change?
So there's a version, 0.1 or version 1. Like, you have to have a version from the beginning, right? Not as an add-on later.
Yes. So to start, some of those things also tie into how do you design the system, because I think we have to design for evolvability as well. And one of the things that I like to emphasize whenever I can is to say it's important to start thinking about public-facing events and private-facing events from the beginning. Because when you have private events, then basically the subscribers are within the boundaries of that service, right?
Yes.
They're not going to be outside of that, hence the word private, clearly. But the thing is that when you have private events, they're more easily changed in the sense that you control the subscribers.
Right. You can just change them because you know who's going to use them, and you can Yeah, yeah, yeah. Makes sense.
Exactly. But with public events, well, then as a publisher, the whole idea of PubSub is that you're unaware of your consumers, that you don't care who is subscribed and why they are subscribed and what they're doing with that information.
Yep,
And
yep.
one of the biggest mistakes is putting a lot of information into that payload, and then you're like, that's probably not a good idea. Oh, these teams are doing what with that data? And
Who
and
knew?
then it's kind of like really tricky to take something away because that breaks your consumers. And it's especially tricky in these large distributed systems where you don't even know who the consumers are, right?
That's true. So you kind of have to think about these things up front. So you don't just like expose everything, and now they're taking all, and you're like, what? Are you taking all? You weren't supposed to take all. Why are you doing this?
Exactly. So one of the things that I always like to compare this to is whenever you think about public facing events, think about it's like posting a picture on social media. Like, are you gonna regret it later? Like, how much do you want to give away? Basically.
Fair enough.
Because
I may have
once
had
it's
a couple or two of those incidents myself, maybe.
Yeah, it's a good way to get people to think about it. But of course, that's just the first step, is right. Just how do you design it? I think a good way to also think about it is, something for the audience to dig a little bit deeper into. Summer events, for example, you could have multiple private events, but then your consumers don't necessarily care about super granular level of events. Those may be very helpful and meaningful inside your service boundary, but it might be helpful to basically summarize them into a more overarching event. So let's say that stuff is added to your shopping basket all the time, and you could be publishing item added, item removed, item increased, whatever it is, right? So the thing is that most of your consumers don't care about that. And at checkout, you just want to know, like, okay, what's in the basket now? I don't necessarily want to have all of that information, all of that traffic, and all of that complexity of understanding what happened before and all of that, and ordering issues and things like that. So then it can be useful to have that service publish a summary event of this is the shopping basket at checkout, right? And then that would give you like the view that you want from a consumer perspective. So that's one way to go about it. Yeah. But then, of course, that's not all, right? Things are going to change whether we want it or not. Like I always say, change is inevitable, right? So then we have to prepare ourselves in terms of how are we going to version these events. And like a lot of attention is paid to that in terms of APIs, but I don't see that same attention being spent on our events. But events are the API, right? In terms of event-driven systems. So how do you prepare yourselves for that? And the first thing to do is basically to have a schema. To have a schema for that data. How is that going to look like? How is that structured? That can also already provide like additional insights into how your consumers are even supposed to treat that data, consume that data. Like a good example is temperature, right? Okay, you have a field in there that's temperature. Okay, what does that mean? Like, is it Celsius or is it Fahrenheit or is it Kelvin? And is it the temperature of light, right? Like it could be anything.
If it's science, then it could be Kelvin.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
and a schema allows you to add that information, to add that sort of what we call metadata, so that it's easier on the consumer side to understand how that data should be interpreted. But what's especially helpful about schemas is that they enable versioning. And then we can start to talk about, okay, how is this schema going to evolve and what type of compatibility strategies do we want to have for this schema?
Okay.
So there are a couple of different strategies. You could have forward compatibility, backward compatibility, full compatibility, and you can even make that transitive. Can apply to any of the previous compatibility strategies, forward, backward, and full. And transitive basically means that, for example, let's say that you want to use forward compatibility, which would make sense probably if you're using Azure Service Bus, for example, as a broker. Then it allows you to delete optional fields and to add fields, whether they're required or not. And consumers can still use the previous version of the schema to basically receive messages that were constructed with the newer version of the schema.
I see. Yeah. Yep.
Right. So when you use backward compatibility, it's kind of reversed, and you can delete fields and add optional fields, and then consumers can use the next version of the schema to still be able to process messages that were constructed with the previous version.
Right.
Now, when you make that transitive, it doesn't only apply to the previous or the next version, but to all of the versions of that schema that you have. So it becomes a lot more restricted. And the thing is that basically allows you to communicate to your consumers. How can this change? Like, how can I expect this thing to evolve? And and it allows consumers to make better decisions on how to write their code and how to basically prepare themselves better, and gives you a lot more flexibility from a producer perspective, because as long as you fulfill the compatibility promise that you set out to basically adhere to, you can keep upgrading to new versions of the schema without breaking consumers. Now, I also want to caveat that, right? Because if you add something to a schema, well, your consumers will still have to upgrade to use that thing. Makes sense, right?
Yes.
But at least it won't break them. They're not going to fail because, oh, something new was added and they don't know what to do with that, right? And the reverse could also be true. If you delete let's say an optional field, well, if your consumers were aware that that thing was optional, which is indicated by the schema, then they would have been prepared to deal with that being removed, because it will just not be there, and they can deal with that.
Yeah, it does make sense, because I can see how the client side or the integrator or whomever, like the who's calling, can have code dependent on the exact nature of the API or the schema from before, right? If they've done it right, then they can survive if you have declared how you are revving this.
Exactly. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
by setting up that, what I always tend to say is that a compatibility strategy that you set up, it's basically a policy decision, right? It's communicating how is the system going to evolve for also from the producer side, but what can our consumers also expect from that? And this is definitely one of the choices that need to be made earlier when building the system. It's not like this afterthought, oh yes, and now we need to version things. No, this is something that needs to be discussed up front. You need to agree on the strategy, how we're going to apply this, how do we see everything evolve, so that you can make as little breaking changes as possible, basically.
Yeah. So one place where I encounter a lot of API schemas and a lot of versions is or API versions is in the Azure management endpoint. There's hundreds of services, right? And they all have a version, and then you can query, you can ask, okay, which versions are you supporting still? Well, right? And sometimes there has been some warnings come up as, oh, this is going to be changed by so and so date. This is not going to be compatible anymore. That sort of thing. So how do you go about, like, can you, is that even a thing you can do? How do you go about removing an old version? Like, okay, we can't support this old shit anymore. What are we going to do? Right?
That's a really good question. So that's, for me, like the next step, right? So first we need to try to set up a system that allows you to make some evolution that is not breaking.
Okay.
And then the next step would be, okay, like, really, there's nothing we can do about this. We really need to break this. You have a breaking change. Well, then it kind of becomes a completely new thing, because the schema has changed. So basically, the meaning of that event has now changed and now needs to be reevaluated by your consumers. And the best strategy to deal with that is to basically first notify your consumers, like, this is not going to be supported, but to also not go and delete it immediately, to basically work with a deprecation warning. It's like we do with public APIs, right? So basically to say, okay, this will be supported for the next 3 months. And throughout that sort of deprecation period, what is important from a producer perspective is, let's say that you have an old order placed event and a new one, right? That throughout the deprecation period, you continue to publish both of those events.
Of course,
And that allows your consumers to gradually start basically upgrading to that new order placed event. In favor of the old one. But even that is quite complicated, right? Because the thing is that, especially in an event-driven system, well, let's say that you're using Azure Service Bus. Okay, so you're subscribed to this topic, and now there's a completely new topic because it's a completely new event. It has semantically changed, therefore it goes to a different topic. At least if you chose to use a topic per event type of topology, of course, assuming that for a moment. Now the problem is that there's in-flight messages, right? How do you not lose anything when you're trying to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
And that requires a really sort of step-by-step type of upgrade strategy. So the whole idea is that during this dual publishing period, when the producer is publishing both of the versions of the event, you basically, as a subscriber, have to go and subscribe to that new type of an event, and as close to that as possible, unsubscribe from the old one.
Yes.
Now, unsubscribing does not mean that your in-flight messages are lost. Like in Azure Service Bus, when you subscribe to a topic, you get a virtual queue or a sub queue, whatever you want to call it, right? So your messages are still there. So you need to keep the handling code in place so that you can consume all of those in-flight messages and you don't lose them.
Right, and so then you'll have to check: is there any more data in this for me at all, or can I stop using it? And then on the other side, if you're the publisher, you probably want to check. I have this break here. How many are still using the old one, and then how many are now using the new one? Do we see a trend of change?
Well, that's the tricky part. That's the tricky part. Is as a producer, you can't really do that. Because like we mentioned in the beginning, sometimes you don't know who your consumers are.
Right.
And that's why, purely from the producer perspective, I think we need to be a little bit flexible with the deprecation period. Like, don't make it a week. Don't make it 3 years, right? But maybe like 3 months, 5 months, depending on how quickly your system landscape can evolve, right? But what I always say from a producer perspective is that if you have a way that your subscribers can get notified of this change, right? And you have set a deprecation time, well, for you, it's not your responsibility to then go and check the consumers, right? This is one of the agreements that you can make within the system. Is like, okay, when the deprecation time has basically been elapsed and we're done, we've given it 6 months, we're done, then you can basically stop publishing that old version of the event. And at that point, assume that all of your consumers have upgraded, if they're good citizens of the system landscape, right?
Yeah, this is hard, of course. Well, this is all brilliant, and I guess we could be talking about this for a long time still, but we don't have any more time to talk about this. So we have to stop doing that, which is a shame. But it's been a real pleasure having you on the show to talk about these very complicated matters of versioning and handling distributed systems. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Good to chat with you.
Yeah, totally my pleasure. And audience, see you next time on The Cloud Show.
Bye-bye.